In 633, the Sassanid frontier did not fail because Persia lacked soldiers, armor, or experience. It failed because its commanders no longer trusted the men standing in their own ranks. At Kazima, Hormuz prepared to stop Khalid ibn al-Walid with an army held together by fear, punishment, and obedience. Later tradition would claim that some Persian soldiers were physically bound together so they could not retreat. Whether every chain was real or not, the system behind them was. If you're listening from another city or country, comment your location below. These forgotten campaigns were fought across borders, but their consequences reached far beyond the battlefield. The first reports arrived before sunrise. A mounted courier crossed the southern approach to Kazima, with salt dried across his cloak and foam on the horse's mouth. He had ridden through the night from a frontier post near the edge of the Arabian desert. The message was short. Armed columns had crossed out of eastern Arabia. They were not raiders. They carried organized banners, guarded their supply animals, and moved under a unified command. The commander named in the report was Khalid ibn al-Walid. At the Sassanid garrison, officers gathered around a low campaign table. The map before them was incomplete. It showed wells, caravan roads, tax stations, small forts, and stretches of open ground marked only by the names of tribes. That was how imperial power looked at the southern frontier, not as a homeland, as a network of routes that had to remain open, settlements that had to continue paying, and populations that had to remain obedient. Hormuz read the report twice. He was responsible for more than one city. His authority covered a vulnerable belt between the desert and the cultivated lands of Iraq. If that belt broke, the damage would not remain local. Roads toward Al-Hira, Ubullah, and the lower river system would become exposed. Tribal allies might reconsider their agreements. Tax collectors would stop traveling. Garrisons farther north would begin demanding reinforcements that the Sassanid state could not easily spare. The empire was already under strain. Years of war against Byzantium had consumed money, animals, weapons, and experienced officers. Political instability had weakened command at the center. Provincial authorities still issued orders in the name of imperial certainty, but certainty was becoming a performance. On the frontier, commanders like Hormuz were expected to hide the weakness. He chose force. Messengers left Kazima carrying mobilization orders. Persian regulars were summoned from nearby posts. Local auxiliaries were ordered to report with their own weapons. Arab clients tied to the Sassanid system were reminded of their obligations. Men who guarded canals, roads, and storehouses were pulled into marching units. The result looked impressive on an accounting tablet. It was not a unified army. Bahram understood this before most of the senior officers admitted it. He was 44 years old, a border officer who had spent much of his service protecting roads that officials in the capital rarely discussed. He had fought bandits, intercepted smugglers, escorted tax convoys, and negotiated with tribal leaders who could become allies in the morning and enemies by nightfall. He knew the difference between soldiers who stood because they trusted their commander and men who stood because armed guards blocked the road behind them. His assigned unit contained both. There were Persian infantrymen with standardized shields and state-issued equipment. Beside them stood local recruits wearing mismatched armor. Some had served before, others had been pulled from farms and trading settlements with little preparation. Several spoke different dialects. Many had never fought together. Bahram watched them form ranks in the dust. The line was straight only when the officers were looking. As soon as attention shifted, men moved toward those they knew. Villagers stood beside villagers. Tribal fighters kept distance from Persian regulars. Some auxiliaries inspected the road south more often than they inspected their weapons. An officer from Hormuz's headquarters noticed. "Separate them," he ordered. "No groups from the same settlement together." Bahram looked at him. "They will fight better beside men they trust. They will desert together beside men they trust." That answer revealed the real condition of Hormuz's army, The command did not ask why the men might flee. It treated the possibility of retreat as a defect to be punished, not as evidence to be examined. Across the frontier, Khalid's forces were moving with a different structure. They were not an enormous imperial army. They did not carry the same weight of equipment. They did not have a long chain of fortified bases behind them. Their advantage was movement. Orders could pass quickly. Units could change direction without waiting for a large administrative system to approve the decision. Khalid had entered the Iraqi borderlands with a clear operational purpose. He needed to destroy or displace the forces guarding the southern approaches before the Sassanids could concentrate greater strength against him. He could not afford a prolonged campaign of static positions. He needed speed. Hormuz knew this. His response was to block the routes toward water and force the Muslim army to approach under pressure. On paper, the plan was rational. The desert punished every delay. A commander who controlled the wells could influence where and when his enemy fought. But Hormuz was preparing to use a rigid army against a mobile one. Bahram saw the contradiction. In the days before the main confrontation, the garrison became a place of public discipline. Men accused of leaving their assigned positions were beaten before assembled units. Supplies were searched for stolen food. Patrols were sent behind the camp to stop deserters before they reached the open country. One group was brought back at midday. They were not experienced soldiers. They were local recruits who had attempted to return to their families after hearing that Khalid's columns were approaching. One claimed that his village lay directly in the expected path of the fighting. Hormuz's officers did not investigate. The men were forced to kneel. Their punishment was made visible because visibility was the point. The command wanted every soldier to understand that the road away from the battle might be more dangerous than the battle itself. Bahram stood with his unit and watched. No one spoke. That silence would later be misread as discipline. It was fear. Imperial records usually reduce such moments to words like mobilization, order, and readiness. They do not record the farmer whose family had been left near an undefended canal. They do not record the auxiliary, who had received no pay, but was expected to die for a border administration that treated his village as a source of grain and manpower. They do not record how many men entered the field already calculating the safest direction of escape. This is what official military history often removes. It preserves the names of commanders. It erases the pressure placed on everyone below them. Bahram returned to his section of the camp after dark. Small fires burned behind windbreaks. Armor was being repaired. Water skins were checked repeatedly. Men spoke in low voices about Khalid. Some described him as a raider. Others had heard of his campaigns in Arabia. They said his forces could cover ground faster than expected, strike before defensive lines were complete, and withdraw before heavier troops could trap them. A young recruit asked Bahram whether the reports were true. Bahram did not answer immediately. "An enemy does not need to be invincible," he said. "He only needs us to make the wrong decision." The recruit looked toward Hormuz's headquarters. No further explanation was needed. The next morning, new instructions reached the officers. Units would remain tightly formed. Commanders were to prevent unauthorized movement. Rear positions would be watched. Any man who left the line without orders would be treated as a deserter. There were also discussions about physically linking selected troops to prevent them from breaking formation. The surviving traditions are uncertain on this point. Later accounts would transform these reports into the defining image of the battle. Persian soldiers chained together, unable to retreat. The detail may have been expanded in the retelling. It may have applied only to certain formations. It may have become a symbol attached to the battlefield after the defeat. But the policy behind the story is not difficult to recognize. Hormuz did not trust the army he had assembled. Instead of correcting the causes of that distrust, he attempted to remove the soldiers' ability to act. Bahram objected during the officers' briefing. If the front rank collapses, the men behind must be able to open space. A senior commander dismissed him. "The front rank will not collapse." That is not a plan. The room became quiet. Hormuz looked at Bahram without visible anger. Your task is to hold the left. My task is to hold it against an enemy, Bahram replied, not against our own formation. The exchange ended there. No officer supported him publicly. By evening, the Sassanid army was moving toward the ground where Hormuz intended to meet Khalid. Dust rose behind the columns. Heavy infantry marched near the center. Auxiliaries were distributed along the wings. Supply animals followed under guard. From a distance it looked like imperial strength. Closer inspection showed men exhausted before the battle had begun, officers enforcing obedience with threats, and units arranged according to political suspicion rather than battlefield effectiveness. Bahram rode beside his soldiers as Kazima disappeared behind them. He knew Hormuz believed he was sealing the frontier. What Hormuz was actually doing was concentrating its weakness in one place. The battle had not yet started. The failure had. The Sassanid army reached the selected ground near Kazima in separate columns, then spent hours being forced into a single formation. Hormuz had chosen the position for its proximity to water. The calculation was simple. Khalid's army had crossed exposed territory from eastern Arabia. Men and animals needed access to wells. If the Persians occupied them first, Khalid would either attack under unfavorable conditions or withdraw into the desert. It was a sound principle applied by a commander who misunderstood his own force. The Persian center was built around the heaviest infantry. These men carried large shields, long weapons, and armor suited for holding ground. Regular formations stood closest to Hormuz's command position. The less reliable contingents were distributed toward the outer sections, where their officers could watch them and mounted troops could block an uncontrolled retreat. Bahram was assigned to the left. His sector included trained border soldiers, local infantry, and several groups recently drawn from settlements along the southern routes. They did not share equipment, experience, or loyalty. Some served the Sassanid state. Others served local chiefs who had agreements with it. A third group had been summoned because refusing the levy would expose their families to fines, confiscation, or arrest. Hormuz's officers called them one army. The formation itself proved otherwise. Orders had to be repeated in several dialects. Units interpreted signals differently. A movement intended to close a gap caused two groups to overlap. Men carrying lighter shields were placed behind heavily armored troops and could not see the signals from the front. Mounted messengers moved constantly between commanders, correcting arrangements that should have been settled before the army left Kazima. Bahram spent the morning separating units and marking clear lanes through which wounded men, couriers, or reserves could move. A staff officer arrived and ordered the lanes closed. "Every space is a road for deserters," he said. "Every closed space becomes a grave when the line has to turn," Bahram replied. The officer pointed toward the enemy approach. "There will be no turning." This was not confidence. It was doctrine hardened by fear. Hormuz believed the most serious danger was not Khalid's attack, but the possibility that his own men would refuse to absorb it. His solution was to reduce their choices. Troops were placed close together. Rear guards were stationed behind suspect formations. Officers were ordered to strike down men who abandoned their position without permission. By midday, ropes had appeared among several units. They were not distributed across the entire army. Even the later traditions do not allow that conclusion with certainty. Some accounts would claim that Persian soldiers were chained together in large numbers, and that the battle received its name from those chains. The story became more definite with each retelling. What happened on the ground was less clear and more revealing. Bahram saw groups of infantry being instructed to loop cords through belts and shield straps. In another section, short metal links were carried by servants from the baggage line. Whether these devices were intended to bind individual soldiers, join files, or secure equipment cannot be established from the tradition alone, but the purpose given by the supervising officers was explicit. The men were not to break formation. A border recruit stared at the cord being tied between him and the soldier beside him. "What if one of us falls?" The officer tightening the knot did not look up. then the other keeps him in line. That was how imperial discipline converted one man's weakness into another man's punishment. Bahram crossed the formation and cut the cord with a knife. The supervising officer grabbed his wrist. These orders come from headquarters. Then headquarters can answer when 5 men are pulled down by 1. You are weakening the line. No, I am allowing it to move. The dispute drew attention. Soldiers stopped adjusting their equipment and watched. Bahram understood the danger immediately. A disagreement between officers could become permission for the ranks to question everything else. He lowered the knife, but did not apologize. Use marked files, he said. Use rear guards. Use signals. Do not fasten men together. The officer left without answering. Within an hour, Bahram was summoned to Hormuz. The Persian commander stood beneath a field canopy, while servants fixed armor around his shoulders. Maps and route reports lay on a table nearby. Mounted scouts had confirmed that Khalid's force was approaching, but had not yet committed to a direct line of advance. Hormuz did not ask Bahram to sit. You removed restraints from assigned troops. I removed an obstacle from my formation. They were placed there because those men cannot be trusted. Then they should not be placed in the front. Hormuz turned toward him. If I remove every man whose loyalty is incomplete, I will meet Khalid with half an army. Bahram did not dispute this. It was the first honest statement Hormuz had made. The Sassanid commander was not managing a disciplined imperial force. He was assembling a coalition under pressure, at a time when the state lacked the resources and political stability to inspire confidence. He needed local manpower, but he did not trust local motives. He needed tribal allies, but he feared they would change sides. He needed heavy infantry, but their equipment made rapid movement difficult. Hormuz had identified real weaknesses. His crime was not noticing them. It was choosing coercion as the answer to every one of them. Fear can hold a position, Hormuz said, for a time. That is all a battle requires. Bahram looked at the deployment map. No. A battle also requires a line that can respond after the first position fails. Hormuz's expression hardened. You speak often of failure. I speak of what an officer must prepare for. You will prepare to obey. The meeting ended with Bahram still in command, but his authority had been narrowed. A representative from Hormuz's staff would remain near the left wing. Rear guards would operate independently of Bahram. Any retreat order had to be confirmed by headquarters. The arrangement created 2 chains of command in the same sector. One was responsible for fighting the enemy. The other was responsible for preventing the first from withdrawing. This detail mattered more than the later image of literal chains. Armies collapse when command becomes divided at the moment of pressure. Hormuz was building that division into his battle plan. Beyond the Sassanid position, the surrounding communities began to feel the cost. Water carriers were ordered away from civilian wells so the army could control distribution. Pack animals were seized from nearby settlements. Grain was collected without immediate payment. Local guides were compelled to identify minor tracks and shallow water points. The official justification was military necessity. The effect was to turn the frontier population into unpaid support for an imperial army, preparing to defend them without consulting them. A village elder approached the camp under a white cloth tied to a staff. He requested the return of several donkeys taken from his settlement. Without them, he explained, his people could not move water from the well to the outlying houses. A quartermaster refused. The army requires them. So do the families. The army protects the families. The elder looked across the camp at the massed soldiers. From whom? He was removed before he could say more. The question remained unanswered because the population faced danger from both directions. Khalid's arrival threatened to bring fighting into the region. Hormuz's preparations had already brought requisition, forced labor, and military control. Empires usually describe this condition as defense. Those living beneath it experience it as occupation by their own rulers. That evening, Bahram inspected the left wing again. New ropes had been issued after his confrontation with Hormuz. This time, They were not attached openly. Some officers had linked small groups behind their shield line, concealing the cords from view. Bahram ordered them removed. A staff representative blocked him. "You no longer have authority over the restraints. I have authority over the formation, not over its discipline." Bahram stepped closer. "Then when the formation cannot move, you will command it." The representative said nothing. Around them, soldiers listened without turning their heads. They had learned how to observe conflict while pretending obedience. Bahram walked through the ranks after dark. He found one man rubbing the skin beneath a cord at his waist. Another had loosened the knot enough to pull free if needed. A third had hidden a small blade inside his sleeve. These were not preparations to fight Khalid. They were preparations to survive Hormuz's discipline. At the center of the camp, the Persian commander received reports that Khalid was altering his approach. Muslim scouts had been seen near one route, then another. The enemy was testing the water system, measuring the distance between wells, and forcing the Sassanid army to consider movement. Hormuz issued new orders before dawn. The army would march again. The wells he occupied were no longer enough. He intended to remain between Khalid and the next water point, even if that meant shifting the entire heavy formation under the rising heat. The soldiers had been tied together to prevent retreat. Now the commander was about to force them into a contest of movement they were not designed to win. The order to move reached the left wing before sunrise. Men who had slept beside their shields were forced upright. Water skins were counted, sealed, and redistributed under guard. Animals were loaded before the soldiers had eaten. Officers pushed the columns into formation while the eastern horizon was still grey. Hormuz intended to reach the next water position before Khalid. That decision transformed the campaign. Until then, the Sassanid army had occupied prepared ground. Its heavy infantry could stand behind shields, protect the wells, and force the Muslims to attack. Now Hormuz abandoned that advantage to pursue an enemy built for movement. Khalid had not defeated him in battle. He had made him move. The Muslim columns had appeared along the southern route, then shifted east before the Persians could fix their position. Scouts reported dust near one well, and mounted men near another. Each report suggested that Khalid might bypass the Sassanid line and seize water farther north. Hormuz could not tolerate that possibility. If Khalid reached the wells first, the Persian commander would lose control of the battlefield before the armies met. So the Sassanids marched. The center moved first, heavy shields resting against shoulders, armor already warming under the rising sun. Cavalry screened the flanks. Supply animals followed through the dust. Bahram's contingent was ordered to maintain contact with the center while also protecting the left from sudden attack. The instruction was impossible to execute cleanly. The central infantry moved slowly because of its weight. The lighter auxiliaries moved faster, but were repeatedly ordered to halt so the line would not stretch. Mounted messengers forced their way through narrow spaces, carrying corrections from headquarters. Advance, close the gap, slow the wing, protect the baggage, increase speed. The orders contradicted one another because Hormuz was trying to preserve a fixed battle formation while crossing open ground. Khalid did not share that problem. His army moved in looser sections, able to concentrate when required and separate when speed mattered more. Muslim scouts remained close enough to be seen, but rarely close enough to be caught. They drew the Persian cavalry outward, then disappeared before heavier support could arrive. This was not random harassment. It was control. Khalid was deciding where Hormuz looked, when he halted, and how much strength he wasted responding to movements that were never intended to become full attacks. By mid-morning, the Persian columns had covered less ground than expected. The heat increased. Armor trapped it against the body. Dust coated the inside of mouths and gathered beneath helmets. Men began drinking from their skins earlier than officers had planned. Water distribution was tightly controlled. The best supply remained near the command units and heavy infantry. Auxiliaries received less. Local recruits were told that additional water would be issued once the army reached the next position. They were being promised water after completing a march that required water to survive. Bahram rode beside the rear files of his unit. He watched men stumble and recover before officers noticed. He saw soldiers wet cloth and press it beneath their helmets. One man used the last of his ration to clean dust from his eyes. A sergeant pointed toward a shallow depression in the ground. There may be water beneath it. There is no time to dig, the staff representative said. There will be less time when men begin falling. The column does not stop. That was the order governing the day. The column did not stop when a pack animal collapsed under its load. The cargo was divided among soldiers already carrying weapons. It did not stop when a recruit lost consciousness. Two men dragged him aside, loosened his armor, and watched the army continue without them. It did not stop when a wheel broke on a supply cart. The axle was abandoned. Sacks of grain were cut open because there were not enough animals to carry them. Food spilled into the dust while hungry men marched past it. Military histories often record forced marches as measurements, a distance covered, a position reached, a maneuver completed before the enemy. They rarely calculate what was consumed to produce that movement. Animals were destroyed, supplies were abandoned, soldiers were separated from their units, local guides were beaten when routes proved slower than expected, men weakened before combat were still counted as available strength, because removing them from the rolls would expose the true cost of command. Hormuz's army remained large. Its usable strength was already shrinking. Near midday, Muslim riders appeared on a low rise to the southwest. The Persian vanguard turned toward them. Cavalry was ordered forward. Bahram's left wing shifted to support the movement. The riders withdrew. Hormuz pressed the pursuit for several miles before scouts reported another Muslim group near the route to the northern well. The vanguard was recalled. The army turned again. The heavy center had to reverse direction in stages. Files collided. Shields struck shields. Auxiliaries received the order late and continued west before messengers forced them back. No battle took place, but the Sassanids lost more time, more water, and more order. Bahram saw the pattern clearly. Khalid was not avoiding battle because he feared the Persian army. He was delaying it until Hormuz had damaged that army himself. Bahram rode toward the command column. Hormuz was surrounded by guards and messengers. His horse was wet with sweat. Dust had settled across the metal fittings of his armor. "The men need a halt," Bahram said. "We halt at the well. The left is losing files. Reform them while moving. They cannot reform while the center changes direction." Hormuz looked past him toward the western horizon. "Khalid is trying to reach the water. Khalid is trying to make us chase him. And if we do not, then we choose the ground." Hormuz rejected the proposal immediately. "He wants us to stop. He wants us exhausted." The commander's face remained controlled, but the decision had already become personal. Every shift by Khalid now appeared to Hormuz as a challenge to his authority. He was no longer protecting a frontier position. He was reacting to the possibility that the enemy might make him appear passive. This is how tactical pressure becomes command failure. A general begins by answering a threat. He ends by answering his pride. Hormuz ordered the march to continue. Bahram returned to the left and found that the staff representative had compressed the formation again. Men were being forced closer together to prevent straggling. The tighter line slowed them further. A soldier fell between two files. The men behind stepped around him until an officer ordered them back into place. No one was permitted to leave the formation to carry him. Bahram dismounted. He lifted the man by the shoulder with the help of a sergeant and placed him across a supply animal. The staff representative objected. "That animal carries weapons. The weapons can walk. The soldier cannot fight. Neither can a dead man." The officer ordered the soldier removed from the animal. Bahram refused. This was no longer an argument about formation. It was a direct struggle over what the army considered expendable. Hormuz's system treated exhausted men as failed equipment. Bahram still regarded them as soldiers under his responsibility. That difference was becoming more dangerous than the enemy's movement. The staff representative reached for the reins. Bahram's sergeant placed a hand on his sword. No blade was drawn. The representative stepped back. The unit continued marching with the unconscious soldier secured across the animal. It was a small act. It changed nothing on the map. But men in the surrounding files saw it. For the first time that day, they saw an officer disobey a command designed to preserve equipment at the expense of a life. Loyalty does not always grow from speeches. Sometimes it begins when a commander refuses to abandon one man beside the road. By late afternoon, the Sassanid army reached the expected water point. Khalid was not there. The wells had not been occupied by a major Muslim force. Only traces of scouts remained, hoof marks, ash from a small fire, and tracks leading north. Hormuz had marched his army through the worst heat to prevent a seizure that had never been attempted. Water was distributed, but the delay created disorder. Units crowded the approaches. Officers fought over priority. Animals pushed between soldiers. Several shallow basins were contaminated by mud before the rear formations arrived. Bahram's men waited. Some received only a partial ration. The army had reached the water and still could not provide enough. Scouts returned after sunset with the next report. Khalid's main force had shifted again. The Muslims were moving toward ground that threatened another route into the Iraqi frontier. Hormuz studied the message in silence. He now faced the same choice as before: remain near the wells and allow Khalid freedom of movement, or march again. The soldiers around him were exhausted. The heavy infantry had spent the day changing direction. Auxiliaries had lost contact with their commanders. Supply animals were failing. The army needed rest, reorganization, and a clear defensive plan. Hormuz ordered preparations for another movement at dawn. Khalid had not broken a Persian line. He had exposed the mechanism controlling it. The Sassanid army could not ignore him, could not catch him, and could not stop moving without making its commander feel defeated. By the end of the day, the Muslims had suffered no major losses. Hormuz had spent water, strength, animals, cohesion, and trust. The battle was approaching. One army would enter it after choosing the moment. The other would arrive because it had been dragged there. By dawn, both armies had stopped maneuvering. The ground near Kazima was open enough for large formations, but not empty. Low rises interrupted lines of sight. Dry channels cut across sections of the field. The wells lay behind the Persian position, guarded by troops who had spent the previous day marching to reach them. Hormuz placed his heavy infantry in the center. The decision followed Sassanid practice. Armored troops would absorb the first pressure, hold the main line, and give cavalry room to work along the wings. In theory, the formation could resist a direct assault and punish any Muslim unit that advanced too far without support. In practice, the army was exhausted. Men stood beneath armor that had not fully cooled from the previous march. Water had been unevenly distributed. Several auxiliary units had lost officers during the confusion around the wells. Signals were revised again before deployment, because commanders did not agree on where the left wing ended and the center began. Bahram received 3 sets of instructions. Hold contact with the center. Advance if the center advanced. Remain in place unless Hormuz personally ordered movement. All 3 could not be followed at once. He arranged his unit in shallower lines than headquarters had demanded. He placed experienced border soldiers near the gaps and kept a small reserve behind the left flank. The representative from Hormuz's staff objected immediately. You were ordered to close the files. I was ordered to prevent the wing from breaking. You are leaving space. I am leaving room to move. The representative threatened to report him. Bahram continued giving orders. Across the field, Khalid formed his army with fewer visible layers. The Muslim line appeared lighter and less protected, but it was not fixed in the same way. Units could support one another without being compressed into a single mass. Mounted groups remained active behind the main formation, carrying instructions and watching for weakness along the Persian front. Khalid did not need to attack every section with equal force. He needed Hormuz to misread the first pressure. The opening contact began with scattered missile fire and brief clashes between forward troops. Small groups advanced, tested the opposing line, then withdrew. Dust rose between the armies and reduced visibility near the ground. Persian officers ordered the front ranks to remain still. The command sounded disciplined. It also surrendered initiative. Muslim troops approached, struck selected points, and pulled back before the heavy center could respond. Each movement forced the Sassanids to decide whether it was a probe or the beginning of the main assault. Hormuz waited. He believed Khalid would eventually commit to the center. The Persian formation was strongest there, and Hormuz intended to meet the attack personally. The later tradition places great emphasis on what followed. Hormuz is said to have moved forward and challenged Khalid to single combat. The exact details are difficult to establish. Such duels appear frequently in accounts written after the campaigns, where the decisions of armies are compressed into confrontations between commanders. But the political logic is credible. Hormuz needed more than a tactical success. His soldiers had seen days of confusion, forced movement, punishment, and divided command. A public victory over Khalid could restore authority faster than any reorganization. If the Muslim commander fell in front of both armies, Hormuz could claim that the invasion had been broken by his own hand. It was a dangerous attempt to solve a structural problem with a spectacle. Hormuz rode beyond the Persian line. His armor marked him immediately. Guards followed at a distance. Officers along the center raised their weapons and shouted his name. Bahram watched from the left. The men around him turned their heads despite orders to face forward. This was the first damage. Thousands of soldiers were now watching two men instead of the enemy formations in front of them. Khalid advanced to meet Hormuz. There was no long exchange of speeches. The distance between armies was too exposed, and neither commander could remain isolated for long. They closed quickly. The clash began under the eyes of both lines. Later accounts would describe Hormuz as a hated frontier commander and present his death as personal judgment. That framing is too convenient. It turns a campaign shaped by logistics, command structure, and political weakness into a simple contest between virtue and corruption. Hormuz's conduct deserves scrutiny, but his death did not erase the system that produced him. The two commanders fought at close range. Hormuz attempted to hold Khalid long enough for selected men to intervene. Whether this had been arranged in advance or emerged during the confrontation is uncertain. What is clear is that Persian soldiers began moving forward from behind him. Muslim troops responded. The duel stopped being separate from the battle. Men rushed into the open ground. Guards collided. Signals were lost beneath shouting. Officers near the Persian center could no longer tell whether they were witnessing a planned advance, a rescue attempt, or the beginning of the general attack. Then Hormuz fell. The effect was immediate, but not because every Persian soldier saw the moment clearly. Most did not. They saw guards closing around an empty space. They saw men retreating from the front. They saw one of Hormuz's banners drop and rise again in different hands. Rumor moved faster than orders. The commander was wounded. The commander had killed Khalid. The commander had been surrounded. The commander was dead. Within minutes, all four reports circulated along the line. The Sassanid army still possessed numbers, armor, weapons, and organized units. What it no longer possessed was a recognized center of command. Hormuz had concentrated authority around himself. Decisions required his approval. Withdrawal orders required confirmation from his headquarters. Even local adjustments had been limited because he feared disobedience. Now the command structure he had tightened could not function without him. A senior officer near the center ordered an advance to recover the body. Another ordered the infantry to remain in position. A cavalry commander began shifting troops toward the opening. A messenger reached Bahram with instructions to move inward and reinforce the center. Before Bahram could act, a second messenger arrived. "Hold the left. Enemy cavalry is moving." "Which order replaces the first?" Bahram asked. Neither messenger knew. He looked toward Hormuz's command position. The field canopy remained in place, but the staff around it was breaking into separate groups. Some were trying to protect the command baggage. Others were attempting to establish who now held authority. The question should have been settled before battle. Hormuz had prevented it because naming a clear successor would have meant admitting that he might fall. This was not personal vanity alone. Imperial frontier systems often depended on individuals whose authority combined military, fiscal, and political power. Removing one man did not simply replace a commander. It opened disputes among officers, families, provincial interests, and local clients. At Kazima, that political weakness entered the battlefield in real time. Khalid did not allow the Persians to recover. Muslim units increased pressure against the center before a new command structure could form. The attacks were not yet a full advance across the entire line. They were directed at points where Persian formations had already begun reacting to contradictory orders. One unit moved forward to recover Hormuz. The unit beside it remained still. A gap opened between them. Muslim infantry entered it. Persian officers tried to close the space, but their signals conflicted with orders already moving toward the wings. Men shifted inward. Others resisted because they had been told not to leave their original positions. Bahram saw the center bend, not collapse, bend. That distinction mattered. A disciplined reserve could still have stabilized the formation. The Persian army was not yet destroyed, but the reserve was receiving instructions from officers who did not recognize one another's authority. Bahram ordered his own men to remain in position and prepared the small reserve behind his wing. The staff representative protested, "Move toward the center. If we move now, the left opens. The center is under attack. The left will be next. You are refusing a direct order." "I have received 2 direct orders." The representative reached for Bahram's bridle. Bahram struck his hand away. The men nearby saw it. The conflict between them was no longer concealed behind formal language. Hormuz was dead, and the officers below him had begun fighting over fragments of his authority, while the enemy remained in front of them. Then a third message arrived. The center was to advance. No commander's name was attached to the order. Bahram refused it. This time, the representative drew his sword. Bahram's sergeant stepped between them. For several seconds, Persian soldiers faced Persian soldiers. No one attacked. The representative lowered the blade first. The moment passed, but the damage remained. The men now knew that their officers could not agree on who commanded them, where they were meant to stand, or which direction they should move. Along the center, the gap widened. Khalid's forces pressed deeper. Hormuz had walked onto the field believing that killing one man could restore control over an army held together by coercion. Instead, his death removed the only point around which that coercion had been organized. The Sassanid line had not yet broken, but it had begun receiving commands from a dead system. The first serious break did not occur at the center. It began where the center had already weakened the wings. As Persian officers pulled men inward to close the gap left by Hormuz's death, the outer formations lost depth. Units that had been placed to protect the flanks were ordered toward a crisis they could not clearly see. Their movement opened narrow spaces between contingents that had never trained together. Khalid's commanders recognized those spaces immediately. Muslim infantry increased pressure against the damaged center, while mobile groups shifted toward the exposed connections on either side. The objective was not to crush the entire Persian army at once. It was to separate its parts faster than its officers could reunite them. This was the correct tactical response to a rigid force under confused command. Once the joints failed, the armor of the whole formation became less important. Bahram saw dust rising from his right. At first, it concealed the scale of the movement. Then men emerged from it in disorder, Persian soldiers from the inner left, falling back without a clear officer, some still facing the enemy, others trying to reach the rear. They were not yet running. They were searching for a line that no longer existed. Bahram sent his reserve forward to create one. "Open the files," he ordered. "Let them through in groups." His men stepped apart, forming controlled passages. The retreating soldiers entered between them. Some stopped and turned, Others continued toward the rear. The staff representative shouted for the passages to be closed. "You are allowing the center to collapse into us. The center has already moved. Drive them back." Bahram looked at the men approaching. Several had lost shields. One supported an injured officer. Another carried no weapon and kept repeating that Hormuz was dead. Driving them back would not restore the center. It would create a fight inside the Persian line. Bahram refused. The representative ordered the rear guards forward instead. These guards had been positioned to stop desertion. They were now facing their own troops with weapons leveled, treating retreating formations as a threat equal to Khalid's advancing units. The result was immediate. Men trapped between the rear guards and the Muslim pressure began pushing sideways. Files overlapped, shields locked against one another. Commands disappeared beneath the noise. A Persian officer struck one retreating soldier and ordered him back toward the center. The soldier did not move. The officer raised his weapon again. Bahram's sergeant caught his arm. "No more." The officer turned. "You protect cowards now? I protect the line you are destroying." The argument lasted only seconds, but the formation around them began to separate into loyalties. Men looked toward Bahram. Others looked toward the staff representative. Several rear guards hesitated. The Sassanid army was no longer divided only by unit. It was divided by what its officers believed discipline meant. Then the Muslim advance reached the damaged junction. The attack came through a space created by Persian movement, not by a direct breakthrough against prepared ranks. Khalid's men entered between units whose shields were facing different directions. They struck the exposed sides of the formations and forced them apart. Bahram ordered his front ranks to angle inward. The movement succeeded at first. His experienced soldiers closed one opening and prevented the enemy from entering the left wing completely. But the inner units continued falling back against them. The pressure came from both directions. "3 steps back," Bahram ordered. "Keep the intervals." His front files obeyed. The units attached to them did not. Some had been instructed that any backward movement was forbidden. Others were still being watched by rear guards. Several groups had cords running through belts or equipment loops, keeping men close enough that one file could not move without pulling another. The first man fell near the inner edge of Bahram's formation. He had turned to avoid a collision and lost his footing beneath the weight pressing from behind. The cord at his waist tightened. The soldier beside him was pulled sideways. A third tried to step around them but was linked to the same group. The file stopped. Men behind continued moving. The obstruction widened. Bahram pushed through the ranks and reached them. He saw the cord twisted beneath shields and trapped around the fallen man's equipment. "Cut it!" The nearest soldier held up empty hands. His blade was gone. Bahram drew his own knife and cut through the first section. The cord released. 2 men pulled free. The fallen soldier was lifted by his arms and dragged into the open passage. A second linked group was already collapsing farther along the line. This was the military reality hidden beneath the later legend. The number of restrained soldiers cannot be known with confidence. The later name of the battle may have expanded a limited practice into an image applied to the entire army. But even in restricted use, the method was disastrous once the formation lost stability. A restraint designed to prevent individual flight converted every stumble into a collective failure. Hormuz had feared that men would save themselves by leaving the line. His system now prevented them from saving the line at all. Bahram moved along the formation, cutting cords where he found them. The staff representative blocked his path. Those men were secured by order. That order is killing the formation. You will stop. Bahram did not. The representative seized his shoulder. Bahram turned and struck him once across the face with the metal guard of his knife. The man fell but remained conscious. No one moved to defend him. That silence was different from the silence Bahram had seen before the battle. Then, the soldiers had been afraid to act. Now they had made a judgment. They had chosen the officer trying to keep them alive over the official defending a command that had already failed. Bahram raised his voice. "Cut every link. Remove every cord. Keep your shields. Move by file. Small blades appeared from sleeves, boots, and equipment belts. Men who had prepared secretly for escape now used those tools to restore movement. The restraints were cut unevenly. Some knots released quickly. Metal links took longer. Soldiers used spear points, stones, and the edges of shields. In several places, men abandoned belts and armor pieces rather than remain attached. The line loosened. That saved some of them. It also exposed how fragile the formation had become. Khalid's forces continued pressing the junction. Muslim troops were not fighting an intact imperial front now. They were confronting isolated groups, some still resisting, others trying to retreat, and many waiting for orders that would never arrive. Bahram ordered his archers and lighter infantry to cover the opening passages. Short volleys slowed the advance. Shield groups stepped forward long enough for trapped men to withdraw, then moved back in sequence. This was no longer the battle plan Hormuz had imposed. It was an emergency withdrawal conducted inside an army still pretending to hold its ground. To Bahram's right, one Persian unit attempted to advance under an officer who claimed authority over the entire wing. The men moved less than 50 paces before discovering that no supporting formation had followed. Muslim infantry struck their exposed side. The unit recoiled into the same space it had just left. Its officer continued shouting for an advance, even as his men turned away from him. Command had become disconnected from reality. On the far left, cavalry began withdrawing toward the wells. Whether they had received an order or acted independently was impossible to tell. Their movement spread panic among the baggage guards. Handlers cut animals loose. Servants abandoned loads. Water vessels overturned as carts were turned across narrow tracks. The rear of the Persian position, intended as a controlled support area, became another obstruction. Soldiers retreating from the front found their route blocked by animals, equipment, and men trying to protect private property belonging to senior officers. The empire had brought its hierarchy onto the battlefield. Even during collapse, guards defended command baggage before they cleared a path for infantry. Bahram saw men forced away from the shortest route because officials were moving Hormuz's possessions towards safety. Chests, armor, documents, and decorated equipment occupied carts while wounded soldiers remained on foot. This is another detail formal histories prefer not to preserve. They describe defeated armies losing standards, treasure, and supplies. They rarely ask which objects were given transport while human beings were left behind. Bahram redirected his unit away from the main rear passage. He chose a dry channel running northwest, shallow enough for men to cross but difficult for cavalry to enter in mass. The route was not safe. It was simply less blocked. "Groups of 20, he ordered. No running. Keep looking back." His soldiers began withdrawing in stages. Some officers still demanded that he return to the original line. Their orders carried no practical force. The original line had ceased to exist. The Muslim advance deepened into the center-left junction. Persian units farther away saw banners moving backward and assumed the wing had broken. Some began retreating before contact reached them. This is how battlefield collapse accelerates. Men do not wait for certainty. They act on fragments. A fallen banner, an empty command post, cavalry moving toward the rear, officers arguing, wounded soldiers arriving from a direction that was supposed to be secure. Each fragment becomes evidence. Together, they become panic. Bahram remained near the mouth of the dry channel, while the first groups withdrew. He counted units as they passed. Border infantry, local recruits, archers without an officer, men from the center who had attached themselves to his command because no one else was directing them. The army Hormuz had tried to hold together by force was reorganizing itself around survival. Bahram looked back toward the field. The Persian center was folding into separate masses. Some still fought in place. Others were being pushed against formations behind them. The gaps between units were now wider than the units themselves. Hormuz's death had removed command. The restraints had removed movement. The divided orders had removed trust. Khalid's army was exploiting all three. Bahram had not yet chosen open retreat, but he had crossed the point beyond which obedience could restore the battle. The next order from headquarters would demand that he hold. There was almost nothing left to hold. The order arrived after the left wing had already begun leaving the field. A mounted courier forced his horse through the dry channel, passing groups of Persian soldiers moving northwest under Bahram's direction. The animal was bleeding from the flank. The rider carried no command banner, only a strip of cloth marked with the seal of Hormuz's headquarters. He found Bahram near the rear guard. "Hold the channel," the courier said. "Reserves are coming." "Whose order?" "The command staff." "Which commander?" The courier did not answer. He had been given words, not authority. Bahram looked beyond him toward the field. No reserve formation was approaching. The center had divided into separate clusters. Persian cavalry was moving away from the wells. The road behind the command position was blocked by abandoned carts and animals. The promise of reinforcement was false. It may not have been a deliberate lie. Commanders trapped inside a collapsing system often repeat information they want to be true. But to the men ordered to remain, the difference did not matter. A false reserve kills as effectively as an enemy charge. The courier held out the sealed cloth. "The position must be maintained until support arrives." Bahram took it, examined the mark, and dropped it into the dust. "Return," he said. "Tell them the left is withdrawing." The courier stared at him. "They will name this desertion. They can name it after they restore the line. You are refusing the last order of headquarters." "No. I am refusing an order from men who no longer control the ground." The courier turned his horse, but did not immediately leave. Behind Bahram, soldiers were still moving through the channel in organized groups. They carried wounded men between them. Archers remained at the entrance, releasing measured volleys before stepping back. The retreat had not become a rout. The rider had seen the rest of the field. He knew the difference. He rode north instead of returning to headquarters. Bahram did not stop him. The dry channel offered temporary protection, but it could not hold indefinitely. Muslim infantry had reached the ground abandoned by the left wing and were testing the approaches. If Khalid's mobile troops moved around the channel, Bahram's force could be trapped against the broken baggage line. He needed to decide immediately. The first groups had already escaped the direct pressure. Hundreds more remained between the channel and the collapsing center. Some belonged to units that had never been under Bahram's command. Others were still waiting for permission to move. Bahram sent runners toward them. "Tell every officer, withdraw by section. Leave heavy equipment that slows the line. Bring water, shields, and the wounded who can be carried." A captain from the center reached him before the runners departed. The man's helmet was gone. Dust covered one side of his face. "You cannot order my unit to retreat. I am giving you a route. My men were told to hold. Then look at what they are holding." The captain turned toward the battlefield. His formation had lost contact with both neighboring units. Muslim troops were closing from the front. Behind him, rear guards still occupied the narrow road and refused to allow uncontrolled movement. "We have not received permission," he said. "Permission is not coming." The captain lowered his voice. "If we leave, they will blame us for the defeat." Bahram understood. This was the final weapon of a failed command. Not physical restraint, but the threat of the record. Officers feared that survival would later be written as cowardice. They knew official reports could remove the exhaustion, conflicting orders, broken command, and blocked routes. A document drafted far from the field could reduce the entire disaster to one accusation. The men had not stood. Empires often protect the dead commander by prosecuting the survivors. Bahram stepped closer. "If you remain, your men will die protecting someone else's version of the battle." The captain looked toward his unit again. Then he nodded. His soldiers began moving toward the channel. That decision spread faster than any formal command. Units that had been waiting for authority saw the movement and followed. Some officers attempted to maintain formation, others abandoned rank entirely and pushed toward the opening. Bahram's men controlled the entrance with shields and spear shafts, forcing the groups to slow down. "No crowding," the sergeant shouted. 20 at a time. A mounted officer arrived from the baggage road with a detachment of rear guards. He carried a standard from Hormuz's staff and claimed command over all forces in the sector. "Close the channel," he ordered. "Drive them back to the line." Bahram stood in front of him. "The line is gone. The center still fights. The center is surrounded in sections. Then these men will return and support it. They will block one another and be cut apart." The officer raised the standard. "By authority of the Frontier Command, any man continuing north is a deserter." The soldiers nearest the channel stopped. The threat reached them because it was familiar. Their pay, families, property, and legal status depended on how the state classified their conduct. A man could survive the battle and still lose everything if marked as a deserter. The officer knew this. He was using families beyond the battlefield to force exhausted men back toward it. Bahram drew his sword. The rear guards lowered their weapons. For several seconds, the two Persian groups faced one another across the channel entrance. Muslim troops were advancing less than a mile away, yet the immediate danger came from men wearing the same imperial insignia. Bahram pointed his blade at the standard. "Lower it. You are under arrest. You have no prison, no line, and no commander." "I have orders." "You have a piece of cloth." The officer signaled his guards forward. Bahram's archers turned. They did not aim at the approaching Muslims. They aimed at the rear guards. No one released. The confrontation ended when one of the rear guards stepped aside. Then another followed. They had spent the battle blocking frightened soldiers and protecting the command route. Now they could see that the route led nowhere. The officer raised his sword and struck the first man who moved. Bahram closed the distance before he could strike again. He knocked the weapon from the officer's hand and forced him to the ground. "Bind him," Bahram ordered. The staff officer was tied with the same type of cord used earlier to restrict the infantry. The irony was not discussed. There was no time. Bahram addressed the rear guards. "You can remain here and defend a dead command, or you can help open the road." Most joined him. A few walked away alone. The withdrawal resumed. Bahram organized a series of delaying positions along the dry channel. Shield troops held each bend, while archers and lighter infantry moved behind them. Once the next group was secure, the forward line disengaged and fell back. The method required discipline more complex than simply standing still. Men had to trust that the group behind them would wait. They had to move at the right moment, not at the first sign of pressure. They had to leave equipment without abandoning one another. These were the same soldiers Hormuz had considered too unreliable to move freely. Under a command that gave them a survivable task, many obeyed. Khalid's advancing forces reached the channel entrance after most of Bahram's groups had passed through. The first clash was brief. Muslim infantry pressed against the shield line but did not immediately enter the narrow ground in mass. They had no reason to sacrifice men against a controlled rear guard while the wider Persian army was breaking elsewhere. This restraint mattered. Dark accounts of conquest often present every victory as a continuous act of killing. That is not how disciplined armies preserve strength. Khalid's objective was to destroy organized resistance and open the frontier, not to waste troops in every confined passage. The Muslims applied enough pressure to keep the Persians moving. Bahram used the remaining time. He returned twice toward the field with small groups, gathering soldiers who had become separated from their units. On the second return, he found the young recruit who had asked about Khalid before the battle. The man was sitting beside a broken shield, unable to place weight on one leg. "Leave me," he said. Bahram looked at two soldiers nearby. "Carry him. We are already behind." "Then move faster." They lifted the recruit between them. A short distance away, another wounded man called for help. Bahram turned toward him, but Muslim troops were entering the outer edge of the abandoned position. There was no time to reach both. He ordered the withdrawal. The decision followed him north. Commanders are often remembered for the men they save. They remember the ones they select not to save. By late afternoon, Bahram's surviving force cleared the channel and reached uneven ground beyond the main battlefield. He ordered no halt until the wells were out of sight. The men moved in fragments, but they were no longer trapped. Cords had been cut. Heavy armor had been abandoned. Units had merged around whichever officers were still giving workable commands. Behind them, the Sassanid position ceased to function as an army. Some formations surrendered their ground and fled separately. Others continued resisting without coordination. The baggage area was taken or abandoned. The water point Hormuz had marched so hard to control passed into Muslim hands. Bahram finally halted near a low ridge. The survivors counted themselves. Entire files were missing. Some had been lost in the center. Some had been left beside the road during the march. Others had disappeared during the final withdrawal and might still be moving north independently. The staff officer who had attempted to arrest Bahram sat under guard. "You have destroyed your career," he said. Bahram removed his helmet. "My career was not worth this many men. They will call you a traitor. Then they will have to admit I survived." That was the choice Hormuz had never allowed his army to make. Bahram had broken the last order, detained an imperial officer, opened the route, and surrendered the position. He had also preserved the largest organized body remaining from the Persian left. The defeat could no longer be prevented. Only its human cost could still be reduced. At Kazima, obedience had ceased to serve the army long before Bahram rejected it. The final act of discipline was disobedience. The survivors did not return to Kazima as an army. They arrived in scattered groups over 2 days, moving north along roads that had once carried taxes, grain, and military dispatches toward the Sassanid frontier. Some still followed officers. Others followed men who simply knew where water could be found. Bahram's contingent remained the largest organized group from the Persian left. That fact protected him. It also made him dangerous. The officers waiting at the northern post had already received conflicting reports. One message claimed that Hormuz had been killed during a planned advance. Another blamed auxiliary troops for abandoning the center. A third stated that the left wing had withdrawn without authorization and caused the entire line to fail. None mentioned the divided orders. None mentioned the blocked roads. None mentioned soldiers being restrained inside formations that could no longer move. The official explanation was beginning before the bodies had been counted. Bahram entered the post with fewer than half the men who had marched under his sector. Some units had lost more, others had disappeared entirely. The survivors carried no captured banners and little heavy equipment. What they brought instead were wounded men, broken formations, and direct knowledge of how the battle had collapsed. The commander of the post received Bahram inside a storage building converted into an interrogation room. 3 senior officers sat behind a narrow table. A map of the southern frontier had been pinned to the wall. Small markers still showed Persian control over wells and roads that Khalid's forces had already entered. The map had not yet been corrected. "Did you order a withdrawal?" one officer asked. "Yes," before receiving authorization. There was no functioning authority left to give it. You were given an order to hold. I was given a claim that reserves were coming. Were they? No. The officers exchanged looks. They knew the answer before asking. The Sassanid reserve system in the region had been overstated for years. Garrisons existed, but many were under strength. Tribal contingents could be summoned, but their arrival depended on negotiation, payment, and confidence in the imperial command. Reinforcements from deeper inside Iraq required time. Hormuz had fought as if a larger military structure stood directly behind him. It did not. One officer placed Hormuz's broken seal on the table. "You detained a representative of the frontier command. He tried to force retreating men back into a destroyed line. He carried lawful authority. He carried authority from a dead commander." The senior officer leaned forward. "Be careful." Bahram looked at the corrected casualty lists lying beside him. carefulness did not save the army. The questioning continued for hours. They asked why cords had been cut. They asked why heavy equipment had been abandoned. They asked why rear guards had been disarmed. They did not ask how many soldiers had survived because of those decisions. This was not an investigation into the battle. It was an attempt to decide where responsibility could be placed without exposing the frontier system itself. Hormuz was dead. Dead commanders are useful to empires when they can be turned into heroes. His errors could be softened into courage. His decision to pursue Khalid could be presented as aggression. His personal confrontation could be described as sacrifice. The surviving officers were less protected. Auxiliaries could be accused of disloyalty. Local troops could be blamed for poor discipline. Junior commanders could be charged with retreating too soon. The state could condemn individuals and leave its own policy untouched. Bahram understood the process because he had seen it before on a smaller scale. A failed patrol became cowardice. A missing tax convoy became local corruption. A revolt caused by seizures became tribal treachery. The imperial center recorded the consequences of its decisions as defects in the people forced to endure them. Kazima would be treated the same way. Outside the post, the human cost continued to arrive. Men returned without units. Servants carried wounded officers whose names secured them space inside the garrison. Common soldiers were placed beneath temporary shelters near the outer wall. Water was rationed again because the post had not prepared for hundreds of survivors. Families from nearby settlements came looking for husbands, brothers, and sons. The guards had no complete lists. A woman asked whether a levy from her village had survived. An officer told her to wait until the rolls were revised. The rolls would take days. Some names had never been properly entered. Others belonged to men attached to units under different commanders. The army had been able to summon them. It could not account for them. That is another function of imperial record-keeping rarely examined. The state becomes precise when demanding service and vague when calculating loss. While the survivors waited, Khalid moved. The victory at Kazima did not end the campaign. It removed the first organized barrier along the southern approach to Iraq. The Muslim army now possessed momentum, access to captured supplies, and proof that the Sassanid Frontier Command could be defeated before larger imperial forces concentrated. The psychological effect reached beyond the battlefield. Local chiefs who had supplied Hormuz began reviewing their commitments, some prepared to negotiate. Others withheld men and animals until they knew which side would control the roads. Garrison commanders sent urgent requests north. Merchants delayed caravans. Tax officials stopped traveling through exposed districts. An imperial frontier does not collapse only when forts are taken. It collapses when everyone living behind those forts begins doubting that the empire can protect its orders. Khalid had opened that doubt. The Muslim advance was not without cost or consequence for local communities. Armies required food, water, guides, and submission. New authority would bring new demands. Conquest did not make civilians invisible to military necessity, but the Sassanid narrative would later reduce the invasion to an external force striking a stable frontier. The frontier had not been stable. It had been weakened by coercive levies, unequal obligations, divided loyalties, and commanders who treated local populations as material to be consumed. Khalid exploited those conditions. He did not create them. That distinction matters. It explains why a force entering from Arabia could move through territory defended by a richer and more heavily equipped empire. The issue was not simply battlefield genius against incompetence. It was mobility against rigidity, coherent command against political fragmentation, and belief against enforced obedience. Bahram was released before sunset. Not cleared, released. The post commander could not afford to imprison the officer responsible for the largest remaining organized body of troops. New defenses had to be formed immediately. Roads had to be watched. Survivors had to be assigned to garrisons farther north. The empire needed Bahram more than it needed to punish him, for the moment. He was ordered to prepare his men for movement toward another defensive position. No formal charge was issued. No statement declared him innocent. His actions remained recorded as unauthorized withdrawal pending review. That was deliberate. A suspended accusation could control him more effectively than a sentence. Bahram left the interrogation room and walked to the outer wall. From there, he could see the southern road. Groups of soldiers were still approaching in the distance. The young recruit Bahram had ordered, carried from the battlefield, lay beneath a shelter near the gate. His injured leg had been bound with cloth. He was conscious. "Did we lose?" the recruit asked. "Yes." "Then why are they questioning you?" "Because I returned." The recruit looked toward the men under the shelters. "Will they send us back?" Bahram did not answer. He already knew the likely decision. The state would gather what remained, rename the units, assign new officers, and place them in another line. Losses would be replaced with fresh levies from the same communities. The men who had escaped one failed formation would be ordered to defend the next. Military systems survive defeat by transferring its cost downward. Inside the command building, officers finally moved the markers on the wall map. Kazima was removed from secure control. The road behind it was marked uncertain. Several wells were circled. A line was drawn farther north, then erased because no one could agree where sufficient troops existed to hold it. The map revealed what Hormuz's reports had concealed. There was no continuous southern defense. There were posts, roads, obligations, and assumptions. Once the main field force was defeated, those separate elements did not automatically become a second barrier. They became isolated points, waiting to learn whether support would arrive. Khalid's victory had opened more than a road. It had exposed the emptiness behind the frontier. Bahram watched the officers redraw the line and understood that Kazima would not remain an isolated defeat. The battle had changed the terms of the campaign. Khalid now held the initiative. The Sassanids would have to react, concentrate, and rebuild under pressure, while more territories reconsidered their loyalty. Later memory would preserve the image of chains. It was an effective image because it reduced the battle to something visible. Soldiers physically tied together, defeated because they could not flee. The deeper chain was administrative. It linked commanders to prestige, local populations to forced service, soldiers to orders that ignored battlefield reality, and survivors to records written by men who had not stood in the collapsing line. Those restraints were harder to cut. Bahram had freed the men beside him from cords and command threats. He could not free them from the empire's need to explain its defeat without changing itself. At Kazima, Khalid ibn al-Walid destroyed a frontier army. But the decisive failure had occurred earlier, when Hormuz tried to manufacture loyalty through control and mistook the inability to retreat for the willingness to fight. The Persian line broke in one day. The opening it created would carry the war deeper into Iraq. And behind the famous commanders, the unnamed soldiers remained where official history usually leaves them, counted when mobilized, blamed when defeated, and forgotten once the map moved north. Subscribe for more forgotten military histories. Comment with your location and tell us whether Bahram's decision was desertion or the last responsible order given on the field.